I'm joined by William Ashcraft, Professor of History at the Community College of Denver, to explore the legacies of British rule in America. Now, when we think of the British Empire, we often think of places like Australia, the West Indies, Africa, India being the jewel in the crown of the empire. But we often forget that perhaps the most influential nation in the world is or was a British colony and has very much British origins. So we're going to explore this further today with William Ashcraft. William, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience, please?
Well, good morning, and thank you for having me. As you said, I'm a professor of history at the Community College of Denver. I hold a PhD in community college leadership and a master's degree in history with an emphasis on American presidential leadership. For about 25 years before I got into this, I was a banker in Southern California. So it's been kind of fun to have a second career. Pretty unlikely, too.
Excellent. Uh, Moving forward with the topic, I came across a video that you put out on YouTube on British America, and that video was sort of a prelude to what was to come next. You talked about the history of indentured servitude in America
Sure.
and how that's sort of lay the foundations almost for slavery in the United States. And I was fascinated by this video. So I'm going to ask you to give an introduction because there are many people out there outside of academia who simply don't really know the extent to which Britain has influenced the what we now call the United States of America. So could I ask you to give a historical overview of what British America was and those early British colonists and how they shaped the nation that was to become the USA?
Well, sure. And when you really consider it, first you have to remember that England was kind of the last guy into the game. Spain and Portugal and France largely were involved in the New World from the days of Columbus forward. In fact, you may remember that the Pope actually had to mediate a dispute between two Catholic countries who were slugging it out for the New World. It wasn't very good for Christianity to have them punching each other. The Treaty of Tordesillas, about 1494, I think, where the Pope essentially drew a line and said everything on this side of the line is Portugal's and everything on this side of the line is Spain's. Well, that left, of course, England and France kind of cold. They weren't exactly happy with the way the line was drawn. But by the time the English got into the game, we were really the leftovers. France had basically settled in what they called New France, which you all call Canada. Mexico, or pardon me, Spain had settled in New Spain, which essentially was the what is now the southwest of the United States and Latin America and most of South America, except where that Treaty of Tordesillas line was drawn. And so we were kind of the leftovers by the time the English got in the game. We were about all that was left. And it was a very interesting news flash for them when they came here, because what they had heard from the Spanish and the Portuguese was, man, you come to the New World and you're going to score gold and silver. Shoot, for the first, I think, 100 years of Spanish and Portuguese involvement in the New World, get ready for this. They brought back 181 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver.
Wow.
And so to the English, they thought, boy, this is, you base everything you do on the past experiences of others, right? And you say, well, this is what it's going to be. And they sent the first group of people that came over, excluding the Roanoke, that failed expedition. The first permanent settlement was in Jamestown. And they sent kind of the wrong people for a camping trip. They sent artisans, they sent shopkeepers, not people that knew how to plant crops. And for about the first 15 years of England being over here, it wasn't very productive. In fact, from 1607 to 1622, I think it was 10,000 British colonists had come here. At the end of that 15-year period, the population of Jamestown was 2,000 because of disease, starvation. A member of the British Parliament said, stop calling America a plantation and call it what it really is, a killing field. Well, you know, they came over, they didn't know how to do what they needed to do. A guy named John Smith comes over and kind of whips them into line and finds a crop. They couldn't find the gold or the silver that the Spanish and the Portuguese, but remember, we were the leftovers. So you're not going to find everything you want. But what they did find was a cash crop that could pay back the investors, the Virginia Stock Company, and that could make them self-sufficient. And that's cash crop was a thing called tobacco. Or as King James called it, that dirty, filthy, stinky weed. Our ancestors were growing weed, apparently. And so but that made them viable. That made Jamestown viable. It turned the corner for them. But the problem with tobacco was that it is a very labor-intensive crop. And they didn't have a lot of laborers. And this is one of those perfect examples where there is no thought to the future, but we've got a problem, we've got to solve it, let's solve it now, without the ramifications. And the thought was, how do we get labor? Well, the Indians weren't going to be much help, and they were outnumbered in any event, the colonists. So they began bringing in poor Englishmen. And that was that indentured status that you'd come and work for an indentured period of time, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, whatever it was. The problem with it, and this is one of those great lessons of history, is that always watch your first choice carefully, because the first choice often is going to predicate the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth. And it will, in this case, will in British America. Because what they did was they essentially created a economy based on free labor. And the only way you're ever going to change that, you're going to have to raise prices, or you're going to have to do something in order to start paying your labor. Well, you start a system on free labor, you basically consigned yourself to that. And that's what they did. And then that just opened the door for all the other things that followed.
Okay.
The other thing that's interesting, by the way, about British America is that none of the colonies, the 13 original colonies, none of them were settled at the same time, nor by the same people, nor for the same reasons. Therefore, there was a kind of a uniquely un-American sense. There wasn't we call it the United States. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, the wonderful parchment, look at how the term United States is spelled. United is lowercase. States is uppercase. That wasn't an accident.
I see.
Because they thought of themselves as 13 individual republics, because indeed they were settled in much that way. They didn't think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves first and foremost as British. And then if you really pressed them, well, where are you from? And they'd look at you and finally say, well, I'm from the country of Pennsylvania. But they would never use the word America because, if you were an American, you kind of had dirt under your fingernails. You were a man of commercial wealth. You couldn't make it in the big leagues, Europe, England particularly. You had to go off to the minor leagues and set all kinds of records. And so that's kind of how we were thought of, and that's kind of how they thought of themselves, actually. But they thought of themselves first and foremost as British. They wanted the British tea. They wanted British china, Wedgwood china, to drink their tea. They wanted British fashions. The elite sent their kids to British schools. They sent their kids to study the masters, Gainsborough and others, the great English painters. There wasn't a sense of being quote unquote American. That emerges, of course, after the revolution.
Mhm. So continuing with this sort of analysis of history then, so as more British settlers arrive in British America, and obviously we have generations who are born there, assumingly
Yes.
who have never been to Britain before, only heard stories. How does this affect their Britishness, if you like? Do they still maintain their British values, or do they start to deviate and almost create new British values?
I think it's probably more the latter, because I think, and I'll talk to my students, many of whom are immigrants, um, and I'll say, are you more or less, whatever the nation of your origin, than your parents? And without question, they always say less. The 18th century is a huge century for British America. The population of British America in 1700 was, give or take, 250,000. By 1770, a few years before the revolution commences, it was 2.5 million. Those population numbers tell you a couple of things. One, we finally turned the corner that more births are occurring, outpacing death, meaning standard of living is probably improving. Um, but immigration is going to be a key factor to this. And natural reproduction, of course, but immigration. And where are the immigrants? Well, the immigrants aren't going to all be English.
Mm,
The immigrants are going to be Irish. The
okay.
immigrants are going to be Scottish. The immigrants are going to be Dutch. The immigrants are going to be from the Germanic states. And one thing that the immigrants all had in common, they didn't need to be told why they didn't care much for England, or they didn't get misty-eyed when they would hear God Save the King. Uh, and so America is becoming less British in the sense of immigration, but it's also becoming less British because the connections to the mother country, shall we say, are becoming are getting further lengthened by the number of years that those initial generations have been here. And so I think that's, to me, that's a very interesting thing, because you've got two factors at work. The factor of work that the people coming over here aren't tied to the British crown, but also the people that were tied to the British crown by nature of just being here, being 3,000 miles away, not having the kind of communication, not having a CNN or a Fox that they could turn in every night and watch what was going on in the mother country, but also the nature of the relationship between England and the colonies contributed to that. We were a cash cow. The connection that England had to us was purely commercial. It was for raw materials, it was for natural resources, it was for markets. So many things like the Navigation Acts that said, look, anything that you produce in America that leaves America must leave on British ships. Everything was kind of geared to benefit the British government and the British economy. Now, it helped our economy as well. But the point I wish to make with this is that on both sides, this is not a relationship that is bound to create strong ties.
Mhm.
Business ties are different than national ties. National ties create emotion, patriotism, and you see the flags and people chanting Brazil or chanting USA or whatever. They don't, you don't see people holding a flag and chanting Microsoft. You don't have quite that same emotion to yell Coca-Cola.
Mhm. And would you say that this is an interesting comparison point to another country, which was also a British, white settler colony in Australia? An observation that I have is that Australia, with a similar history to the USA, but obviously not identical, seems to have retained much more of its British identity than what you're describing was the case in 18th century United States. Why might that be? What do you think?
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is I'm not sure that I would agree that I would say that we did think we were British. But where the rubber hit the road in this relationship was that our definition of what being British meant was not the same as the British definition
Right. Mm-hmm.
that they had for us.
Okay.
We were the colonies. Therefore, we were a step beneath. We were to be dictated to, not to be consulted with.
Mm-hmm.
And we felt, because we looked like them, and let's not forget how important looking like the people that are ruling you, that in some ways that seems to infer certain rights and privileges, because what do you mean we're the same? Look at us, there's no difference.
Mm-hmm.
um, was it Dr. Johnson who said, isn't it interesting, the largest yelps for freedom come from American slave owners? Well, those people, the slaves, didn't look like them, but the slave owners looked like
Mm-hmm.
the people in England. And they said, well, we're British subjects. You
Mm-hmm.
you cannot tax us without our consent.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot tax us without representation. We want representation. But then I've always argued, did they really want representation? I mean, it's a cute bumper sticker to put on the back of your colonial horse in 1770, no taxation without representation. I say to my students all the time, just because it fits on a bumper sticker or because it fits in a meme doesn't mean A, you should believe it. Number two, it doesn't mean that that it is true.
Mm.
I don't know that we really wanted taxation. We had for about 150 years been given autonomy by England to tax ourselves, govern ourselves. I mean, we created the House of Burgess. Each colony had their own legislature. Parliament essentially had a hands-off attitude towards us. I mean, we were kind of a rubber stamp. They never really said no too much to anything. And so we kind of were autonomous until the 7 Years' War, or as we call it over here, the French and Indian War.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of that time, it was decided that America had cost the crown a decent amount of money, 130,000 pounds, I think it was, that there was a debt from the war. And the Parliament said, fine, you ought to help us pay for this. You guys caused it. You can't fight your way out of a wet paper bag without us. And so we need you, you need us. And from that point on, for the first time in 160 years, Britain really kind of rediscovered that we were there and felt that we needed more oversight. And so when we say, well, you can't tax us without our consent, that sounds like, well, then why didn't England give us consent? Just put a few people in Parliament. Shut us up. Mm-hmm. The problem is, if you're the colonies, it's like when you get into an argument with your parent, the parent always has to win. Mm-hmm. They can't lose. Mm. And England was the parent. So they weren't going to buckle under, because then what did that mean? They'd have to give people in Jamaica voice, people in Haiti, people in the Bahamas, all part of the British New World. Would they have to give ultimately those nice little guys in India a say? And that was a non-starter. That was a nothing burger for them. There was no way they were going to do that. But on the other hand, did we really want that? Because think about it, in a 400-seat parliament, what are we going to get? 5, 10 votes? What we really wanted was to be left alone and not have to pay taxes. The average Englishman paid about 33% of their taxes to the English government. The Americans paid less than 5%.
Okay.
And so if you're the crown, it's like, well, wait a minute, this makes sense. This is kind of a no-brainer. I can't keep taxing my own people to pay for you. How about if I have you contribute a little more to the empire? Mm-hmm. But we didn't see it that way. We saw it as, we're English citizens, give us respect. And they said, no, we don't have to.
So moving forward then, so we obviously get to a point where tensions arrive at a point where we have the War of Independence, and the result of that is that America declares itself as an independent nation. So almost overnight, I'm summarizing, but those millions of descendants of British settlers who, as you rightly said, saw themselves as British, wanted to be British, wanted the same rights as Englishmen, they were no longer British, they were American. Now, despite the flag change and this obviously making official of this new nation, at that point when America is an independent nation, how British would you say they were in terms of their values?
Well, let's be clear. They really weren't American when they became American. that's that's probably a better way to put it. That because we may have forgotten that the first attempt at a national government that failed spectacularly was called the Articles of Confederation. We really didn't know what we wanted. We knew what we didn't want, which was a king. We knew we wanted democracy, but we really didn't know quite what that was going to look like or how it would, how it would unfold. And so what we did was that the thought of a strong national government just put everybody on edge because they felt that they had fought a revolution against a strong national government that had kind of lost its way and, kind of gotten over the rails. And the Articles of Confederation was, quote unquote, a league of friendship. So we're not going to enforce anything because you never have to force a friend to do things. We're going to say to our friends, all 13 friends, send us whatever money you can, send us whatever men for troops you can, whatever you feel good about, And needless to say, nobody did anything because they didn't want to support a strong government. And things really about unraveled. George Washington by 1785, 86 is concerned that the revolution will have completely failed. There are armed rebellions in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Jersey, I believe, are threatening to go to war. North Carolina is having territorial disputes with Virginia. And there's really nobody that is able to kind of right the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the reason is they had never really dealt with one another. If you can imagine, a guy in Pennsylvania had as much to do with somebody in Georgia as somebody in England maybe does with somebody in another country in the world. They had separate currencies.
Mm-hmm.
They had separate currencies. Each state or colony, excuse me, now states, issued their own currencies. So if you went from Massachusetts to, let's say, New Jersey, you would go in and you'd have to have your Massachusetts money evaluated in much the same way that if you took a peso in or a yen or whatever, or a euro over here, and the banks would say, well, this is how much we'll give you for it. So there just wasn't a sense of America. It was still every colony or state for themselves, and the biases towards each other. The biases of, well, those guys in Massachusetts, they're kind of cold and they're kind of crabby. Oh, those guys down south, they're into gambling and horse racing. They're kind of lazy. All those stereotypes that we all do were rife in America. And so when the Constitutional Convention is held in 1787, I think it's one of the great miracles of all time, because you've got to get people to come together and not just think about the interests of their own states, which they had been conditioned from, infancy to think of, but also to deal with people that they had been predisposed to not like because they were from different parts of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do I create a sense of nation when I've got 13 different, 12, because Rhode Island refused to play. They didn't want to go. They were called Rogue Island for a while after that. But how do I get these guys to try to play and think of themselves as a nation? In addition, how do I, every time I give a power to somebody, am I creating something I don't want. So the more powers I give to Congress, have I created another hated parliament? The more powers I give to this president figure, have I created a king? And they really walked a tightrope, I think, for 4 months to try to create a sense of nationhood and then these other issues as well.
So I want to continue now and kind of explore the legacies of British rule in what then became the United States of America. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Constitution.
Yeah.
How far was the Constitution influenced by British values? We talk about the philosophy of John Locke as a Scottish philosopher. How far would you say it was influenced by British
Well, I
values?
would say certainly in the Declaration of Independence, what I refer to as our national birth certificate, um, far more John Locke. I think Jefferson, at least in the first couple of paragraphs, might have had some trouble with plagiarism. Uh, because a lot of what he says comes from John Locke. For instance, the idea of a legitimate government derives its powers from the consent of the governed. That's John Locke. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of, well, Jefferson said the pursuit of happiness. Locke said life, liberty, and property.
Yeah.
I don't think that those two are incompatible. I think either way, for you to be able to pursue happiness, you need to have some property. And don't think property only as real estate, which is our typical definition these days. But anything you own is property. To go to school, it takes some property to get the degree in what you want to help you to pursue happiness. So I don't think those. But the Southerners, when they heard life, liberty, or property, looked at Jefferson and said, "What are you talking about? They could be coming for me and for my property." And so Jefferson reworked it into the pursuit of happiness, which I think is also interesting. Government does not exist to make you happy. Government exists to give you the opportunity to pursue happiness. That means there's not a guarantee of happiness, just a guarantee that you can pursue it. But that's Locke, and there's several other things throughout the document that are kind of Lockean in nature. The Constitution, where it falls on English, one of the things that immediately comes to my mind is the remedy that we use for removing public officials who have violated public trust, meaning impeachment. And we wanted a way to remove them. And so we said impeachment. And then the founding fathers, and they didn't spend a lot of bandwidth on this, but they said, okay, so what would justify an impeachable offense? What they do, they went to English common law, high crimes and misdemeanors.
Fascinating.
They didn't define what that was, and we still argue about it today. President Trump's impeachment a year ago, roughly, did it rise to the level of quote unquote high crimes and misdemeanors? President Clinton's 20 years ago, did it rise to the? Well, we don't know because they didn't really define what a high crime or a misdemeanor is. But that came straight from English common law.
Wow. So when they were sort of forming this, the political identity, how the country was to govern itself, why did they not adopt a very British model of parliament, or would you say that they adopted a new style of government that had British influence?
Well, with the Constitution itself, it's probably fair to say it was more influenced by a Frenchman, Montesquieu, who talked about, and Locke talked about separation of powers too. I don't want to make it sound like Montesquieu was the only guy that ever thought of this, but he also did talk about checks and balances. Locke did as well, and talked about, Montesquieu wrote this wonderful book. Let me just give the preamble. In the 1740s, called The Spirit of Laws. And this is very much an Enlightenment document. Montesquieu says, look, every country has certain laws or customs or whatever. Why is it that the French go about things this way? Why is it the English go about things this way? And he believed he could answer that question. And What he found was, as a Frenchman, this is surprising, he found that the most perfect uh, government was the British government. And he said the reason is because you have a separation. You have an executive, you have a legislature. Does this sound familiar? And you have a judiciary. He said, boy, look at this. You've got the judiciary that interprets the laws, you've got the legislature that passes the laws, and you've got the executive or the king that enforces or carries out those laws. There's a nice, clean separation. Well, he didn't quite get everything. The judiciary was really an arm of the king, wasn't quite as separate as he thought. But that would be the truth. If I went to try to evaluate a government of another nation, I might not get it all right either.
Mhm.
But we heard that, and in the justification documents called the Federalist Papers, Madison regularly referred to Montesquieu as the celebrated Montesquieu.
Mm.
You know, they really liked the separation of powers and checks and balances. The genius of the American founding fathers, I would say, is that they saw the world not the way they wanted it to be, but they saw the world and human nature the way they believed it was.
Okay. Mhm.
That you and I are a mix. We can be cruel, we can be kind, we can be stingy, we can be generous, we can be humble, we can also be ambitious as Satan.
Mhm.
And what they tried to do, as Madison put it, to create a government and a system of checks and balances that can use ambition to counter ambition.
Mhm.
You know, to use the dark impulses that all of us carry as human beings and the light impulses that all of us carry as human beings, and use them rather than be used by them.
Okay.
And so when you say, did they create a uniquely American, or did they create an American with a English twist? Well, look at the legislature. We went with the House of Representatives, House of Commons, and we went with the Senate that was supposed to be the kind of the wisest men,
Mhm.
uh, House of Lords.
Lords, yeah.
Yeah. So I think we tried, you know, but it's like, you know, when we're teenagers, I joke with my students about, for one of the first lies of reproduction, I will never be like my parents.
I
Well,
was
they're your
thinking.
models. Of course you will,
Mhm.
you
Okay.
know,
So that
and
was
we'll,
actually my next question. Sorry to interrupt.
no, you're fine.
Before we move on to the issue of race, my
Mhm.
last question on this sort of subtopic is: was there any resentment that they became independent? Many of these people, you know, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, they had British ancestry. Was there any
Mhm.
resentment where they wanted to sort of make themselves less British after the War of Independence?
Well, let me digress just slightly, like I never do. Uh, During the American Revolution, it is really popular to think everybody was on board, right? Everybody lined up and they all marched with the flag and the fife and drum and, you know, all those things. Probably a third of the American colonists supported revolution and independence. Probably a third of the colonists opposed revolution and independence. We called them loyalists.
Mhm.
And probably a third said, check back with me after the war. I'll tell you which side I was on. You know, and after the war, probably 250,000, I think that's the right number, of loyalists left. Some went to Canada, some went to England, and they weren't welcomed with open arms. They were
Mm.
still looked at as Americans. I mean, talk about being a guy without a country. So I think it took some time, and there are people that will argue that it wasn't until the Civil War, 80 years or 4 score and 7 years later, as Lincoln would say, that we actually really became, if you will, a country,
Mm.
really became a nation. We had been a theoretical nation for 85 years, roughly. Uh, but I think those roots of us not being American when we started, but being Pennsylvanians or New Jerseyans or North Carolinians or whatever, I think that took a long time.
Mm.
And I don't even know fully I think you could even say maybe even World War II in some ways might have really cemented the concept of nationhood, but most historians would say the Civil War at least hastened that
Hmm.
development. So,
Right. So I
so I
want
would
to,
say the idea of becoming American in our own right. Yeah, there were people after the Revolution who, one real prominent guy you may have heard of, Noah Webster,
hmm
who went to work on a dictionary of American English. That was what he called it.
hmm
And he said, we have a chance to remake the world. We have a chance to do things the right way. We're the new world. The old world has these bad, nasty habits, get away from them. And we can, as Thomas Paine said, we have it in our hands to begin the world again. And so there was some sense of rejecting uh, Britishness,
hmm
but some of that is going to be helped by immigration.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Some of that is going to be helped by some very noted Anglophiles who, guys like John Adams and more so Jefferson, of course, who kind of got out of bed every morning, kind of knowing why he hated the British, and his associate, James Madison. And of course, we had another war with them 40 years or so after the Revolution, the War of 1812. If you blinked, you missed it. Um, but that war was later on, we called it the Second War of Independence. We even thought during the Civil War that there was a chance that the British were going to
Yeah.
involve themselves and jump in on the side of the South. There was fear that the textile mills in England were going to come to a halt because of cotton being not being shipped,
hmm
and that would force England's hand. Well, they kept out. And I think that more than anything was kind of, from our point of view, that was kind of the thing that helped to create better relations.
Okay.
We call it that special friendship or
hmm
whatever. It started after the Civil War
Okay. hmm
when England had sat out, and by them sitting out, that also kept the French out because the French weren't going to jump in if the English didn't.
hmm
And so by England sitting out and letting us sort it out, we kind of said, okay, maybe we can do business with these guys. Maybe they aren't so bad after all.
hmm
But up to that point, there was a lot of anti-English. Andrew Jackson hated the English. We wanted to go to war in 1845 or so with the English over the Oregon Territory
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
threatened war with England if they didn't uh, give us a favorable uh, amount of territory in that. There was some arguments over Hawaii. There was some arguments over the idea of building a canal.
hmm
Um, but even prior to the Civil War. And so once the Civil War happened, then that enabled a rapprochement, if you will, between us and the English.
Yeah, brilliant. We could explore that in more detail, but I want to move on now to another
Sure.
subtopic, which is the issue of race. So we've all been privy to some of the unfortunate incidents that have happened, particularly recently this summer. There was international protest about racial inequality, obviously the death of
Yes.
George Floyd. Again, keeping on topic, a very brief, a very open question. So answer it how you may. How much has racial tensions in America, so how much does racial tensions in America have roots in British America?
Well, I think that's I think this is America's original sin. Um, and I think that um, we've never really had meaningful conversations about these topics. And there are a lot of reasons why we don't, a lot of reasons why we haven't. Nobody likes to be reminded of ugly parts of their history, their own history, much less a national history. And so therefore, people that often look like me will minimize those events or put them in context. And so that was 200 years ago. Come on, unpack, get over it. I think let's just chat just for a minute about slavery in British America.
Mm-hmm.
You and I know that slavery has been around since almost since as long as we've been around. Uh, we believe in some ways. Herodotus tells us the slaves built the pyramids. You know, uh, Greeks enslaved Greeks, Romans enslaved Romans. I mean, even the word slave comes from the word Slav. Those people that were kind of caught in the middle of Europe, and people from Russia would come and grab them, and people from Western Europe would go in and grab them, and those Slavs became synonymous with labor for which you did not pay, and that's where the word slave originates. The uniquely British, and we have to say British in this case because it is an American. We're not American yet. When the first Africans come to uh, the New World in 1619, to America, I should say. There were about 20 of them. Many of them were under an indentured status. I mean, we have evidence throughout the 1600s that there were Africans who earned their freedom, just as the white indentured servants did. There was no separation of races. It wasn't uncommon for the if you will, black field hands to go with the white indentured field hands and go over to the local pub and hoist one at the end of the day and talk about what a jerk their boss was, much like we all do at the end of the day. Um, and there just wasn't that separation. In fact, there was a guy, I can't remember his first name, but last name Johnson, an African American guy who earned his freedom, became a property owner, was even elected to the House of Burgess, a legislature in Virginia, and owned other black slaves. There wasn't that everybody was a slave in a sense or an indentured servant. In other words, there wasn't a distinction between races or between color. Any of us could be slaves. Well, if you think about it, then that means there's an implied equality, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
If any of us can do this, we're all equal. About the 1670s in Virginia, there was a guy named Nathaniel Bacon who raised a pretty hefty rebellion against Virginia, he and his followers. And some of it had to do with the typical rebellion cause, haves and have-nots. And what the Virginian legislature said was essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, but essentially they said, if we're going to be successful, if we're not going to have rebellions every now and then, what we're going to have to do is create a permanent underclass. And so what they chose to do was make slavery permanent, whereas before it had not been.
Okay.
And the unique contribution is that for the first time, slavery became based on race. And the damaging aspects of this, one, that then from that point on meant that freedom was equated with a white skin, bondage was equated with a dark skin. But the other thing that it caused, I think, that we kind of forget about, we don't even think about. First of all, I would wager you that most Americans didn't even realize that white people were slaves as well at one time.
Yeah.
And didn't realize that at one time we drew a line in the sand and said, here and here. I will wager you that most don't even know that. Harry Truman used to say, the only thing that is new in the world is the history you don't know. And I think he's right. And I think there's a lot of our history on either side of the Atlantic that our people do not know. And it's frankly, it is to our detriment that we don't know. But now think about the other damaging aspect of this. So once I now say only people that look like this person are slaves and only people that look like this person are free, the natural question somebody is bound to ask is, well, why?
Hmm.
When I was a kid, I played with these guys. How come they're slaves and I'm not? Now, think about the things that will now enter into the conversation, because now I have to justify why I have made this exclusion. So now I say, well, God made them that way. Well, they're not very bright. Well, if we left them to their own devices, they would eat their young probably. They're not very civilized. Well, they're lazy and shiftless and you can't trust them. And so that's why we have to kind of whip them and be on them. And I found one of the great lessons of history, the big H, history, national history, and little h, personal history, is the more you have to explain why something is a good idea is in direct relationship to how bad of an idea it really is. Think about all the conversations we had with our parents, why we should be able to go to a concert or a party or date this person or that person. And we knew, bad idea, but we had to keep justifying it. And that's what we've done with slavery. We will justify, defend, protect, insulate. You don't have to do that with good ideas. You ever notice that?
Yeah. So my next question on that is the Native Americans. So at the time when slavery in British America really started to distinguish itself as a racial phenomenon, whereas previously you said it hadn't been, where did the
Yeah.
Native Americans come into this with that?
Into what?
Into this kind of new hierarchy that was created?
Well, we had thought of them. It's kind of an interesting sidebar to it. Americans, while we talked about savages, we had been predisposed by some of the uh, Spanish Catholic friars who had come over, uh, uh, Las Casas for one, and several others who had come over and said that the Indians were humble, they were docile, they were well suited for Christianity. And so even in America, we kind of then a hierarchy within a hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
You had, of course, European Americans or white Americans at the top, and you had Native Americans because they were maybe could be civilized. And then we believed that the Africans were the less civilized.
Okay.
And Europe had a part of that, and some of the men um, who wrote about Africa would, and I'm talking about in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, would talk about the hypersexualized African women, the uh, and some of those stereotypes that lingered, and even dark-skinned Europeans would write about Africans and Africa in kind of a fallen country or a fallen people, if you will. Um, and certainly those views, made its way to America, but also they made their way to America as a willing, almost a justification. Like, see, it's okay what
Mm-hmm.
we're doing. It's okay. And see, they agree with us.
Okay. So the next, I want to talk about the economic benefit that was reaped from slavery. So in the United Kingdom now, emerging are more records, which conveniently, I haven't come across many records which are from before 1800, which is quite interesting.
Right.
But massive, companies, organizations in the UK, which are very much a part and parcel of our culture. It's now emerging that they derive much of their early wealth from slavery. We're talking large amounts of figures. There's even some historians that suggest that certain prime ministers that we've had in the past came into the wealth that sort of birthed the education circles that they mixed in, and
Oh,
then
sure.
derived from slavery. So I want to talk about British America first of all, and then we will move on to independent America. Um, how much money or economic benefits did Britain make from slavery in British America?
I really can't quantify that.
Okay.
I would just say that certainly in the 150 years or so that British America was British America, uh, tobacco was a huge cash crop. Um, I guess it's probably also fair, and there were other products as well, indigo, rice,
Mm-hmm.
sugar in the Caribbean that were huge. Rum that also came from the Caribbean. Um, that was all created by slave labor.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a reason, I think, or another part of this that we forget about. In 1865, Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, he never condemns the South. I mean, here we are about a month from the end of the Civil War, and he's speaking to a crowd largely of people who have either suffered much because of the war or new people who had suffered much because of the war. And he does not condemn, but he will say, and this is again a paraphrase, but it's pretty close, if we shall consider that this war is the woe given to us for the sin of American slavery, then as was said 2,000 years ago, so it must be said today, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous forever.
Mm.
Think about that, an American president referring to the sin of American slavery, because he knew that New Englanders, guys in Massachusetts, and Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and others, they were creating ships that were carrying slaves or carrying slave products. Um, he knew that that we all gained something, perhaps not as much as others, but we all gained something from this, and to, as a politician would, blame somebody else,
Of course, yeah.
he took the statesman-like approach and said, wait a minute, we all have to answer to God for this one,
Mm-hmm.
not just those guys.
So,
And I think that's true throughout the British Empire as well. Anyone that employed slaves, we all have a part in it.
mm-hmm. So, uh, independent America, then, how much economic benefit was reaped from these hundreds of years of free labor? If you could sort of
Well,
put it on a scale of 1 to 10.
you notice that I didn't say anything about cotton,
Yeah, yeah.
because cotton, now you can put that one at the feet of the United States, because a northerner, Eli Whitney, came up with an idea called the cotton gin. Cotton wasn't a very productive crop prior to the cotton gin, because it would take on average one slave 10 hours to pick and then get the seeds out, about 1 pound of lint. Not very productive. But the cotton gin, as part of the Industrial Revolution, or cotton engine, if you will, gave the ability to mass produce cotton.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly, cotton became king. And certainly by 1860, the last year of peace in the United States before the Civil War, about, I think it's 75% of the world's cotton supply came from the United States.
Wow.
And so certainly the textile mills in London and elsewhere, Manchester and so forth, were kept humming because of American cotton picked by American slaves.
Mm-hmm. Continuing with the issue of race, we'll wrap up in about 15 minutes or so. Continuing with the issue of race, um, there was a report that came out recently that suggested that the Ku Klux Klan had very Scottish origins. Do you know anything about that?
No, actually, I don't.
Okay.
I would have to plead ignorance on that one.
But that was a leading question to really looking at. So the issue of race in America, which is
Right.
obviously is extremely problematic and it needs solving. Um, the British were masters at creating a system. And from my studies of colonialism, what sets British, I don't want to use the word successful, but what made British colonialism successful, quotation marks, than French, Spanish, Portuguese, was that they were able to create a very well functioning system where, with the exception of America, the colonies functioned very well and Britain was able to reap the benefits that they intended from those colonies. Um, does the structural racism that exists in America bear any resemblance to that systematic colonization that we would talk about here?
Well, I think, as I said, slavery is our original sin. And
Yeah.
so once we separated people based on race, and then we had to explain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the British Broadcasting Corporation did a wonderful series about, a dozen years ago called A History of Racism.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a super documentary, and if you can find it on YouTube or wherever, I would encourage you and your listeners even to really investigate it. Their argument, which I found very compelling, was that it wasn't racism that caused slavery, it was slavery that caused racism.
Mm. Yeah.
Because for just the reasons we talked about a moment ago, that as soon as I separate based on this one distinguishing characteristic, now I have to explain or justify why I have done so. And those things, if you think about it, we tell that enough. We tell it over and over and over for 250 years that these people are, savages. These people are hypersexualized. These people are not smart. These people are shiftless or sneaky or equated with Satan, black devils. When you look at colonial America or in that 17th century world, how is Satan portrayed? Black.
Mm-hmm.
And so you create this narrative that you repeat over and over and over and over again. And I think one of the reasons it was so hard for slavery to end, that it took a war
Mm-hmm.
to end it,
Mm-hmm.
was because we had drawn the line based on race.
Um,
So it wasn't even just freeing the slaves. I mean, the Russians freed the serfs in 1861. They didn't have near the turmoil. Why did we? Because I think the way we had created it based on race, it made it a lot harder
yeah. Mm-hmm.
to end it.
And we see that some of the legacies of that creation today. Final question on race. The question of reparations has been put forward by many Caribbean nations. It's the idea that France, Britain, Spain should, not just in the form of financial compensation, but should take active steps to repair the damage that was done. Do you think that African Americans and potentially Native Americans are owed some kind of reparatory justice?
Uh, from a moral standpoint, of course,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
the issue is that, from what I can tell, that because so many of our citizens really don't understand their past, really don't, or they get a highly sanitized version of their past in the public schools, uh, because I think in the public schools history isn't taught to be 100% accurate. I think history is taught in the public schools in a sense to create some sense of or sort of faith in the institutions and the country and its people. I think that's true of any nation. You want to portray that you have this nation of wonderful moral people that have done wonderful moral things, and and so that you'll go and do wonderful moral things when it's your turn.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, frankly, I don't have an issue with that. But I think what happens is that then you don't get the whole story. And if you don't have a reason or an inclination to read more, you have that sanitized version that isn't accurate. And I think, to be honest, I think many of the people in our country do not understand the racial component of slavery, certainly do not understand the violent aspect of slavery, the rape of slave women. And you say, well, wait, what if they were willing? Well, if you can't say no, I think we know what that is.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have the ability of giving consent or withholding consent, I think that's pretty obvious, legally at least. The idea of being ripped from your country, people that don't look like you, people that don't talk like you can't understand them. You're taken away from your country, or from your land, not country. They didn't know what that idea was. But the idea of your lands, where your ancestors, the spirits of your ancestors were, to be taken away from that, and then along the voyage to be threatened that you would be killed or that you would be eaten by these people, anything to induce fear. It's little wonder that some would throw themselves overboard. They'd rather drown than to go to who knows what. I don't know how we can say that this didn't have some tremendous psychological, emotional uh, uh, effect. And I think for us to say otherwise really denies the historical record. But the problem is, to accept that, then you're also having to accept your own culpability.
Yeah.
You're having to accept the fact that people that look like me did what we did to people that look like them. And it's much easier to have this highly sanitized, gone with the wind version of what slavery was. But it wasn't that. It may be in some cases, but it certainly wasn't that in all by any stretch. And the fact that it wasn't that in all should repulse and infuriate any of us, and want to do anything and everything we can to help the descendants of those folks feel a part of things and to feel accepted. And but I don't know what that is, to be honest.
Interesting. It's a really fascinating topic that we could do an entire interview on. But I want to end on a perhaps lighter note.
Oh, thank you.
And that is accents.
Oh, yeah.
I came across a really interesting study that suggested that the modern day American accents is actually closer to the 17th century English or British accents. Can you cast any light on that?
I heard a wonderful interview 15 or so years ago by a British historian who I really like a lot, a guy named Paul Johnson. And Paul Johnson said the same thing. He said, actually, he says, you guys now, you Americans, sound more like George Washington 200 years ago than we do. And what he suggested, and I thought this was really interesting, like all breakups, and this was, understand the American Revolution was a breakup. And it was a breakup that probably would have happened at some point. But I would always argue it didn't have to happen when it did, and it didn't have to happen the way that it did. I think there were other ways it could have happened, like a lot of breakups in our lives, right? There's some that you sit there and say, why did that happen? That didn't need to happen. And this is one of those that didn't need to happen, at least not right then. And what Johnson said was kind of like that idea of a breakup, when you say, well, that's it, I'm going to dye my hair, or I'm going to get a new car, or I'll show them, The British took that same approach, only instead of dyeing their hair or losing weight, they said, we're going to add a little affectation to how we speak. So to separate us from those commoners over in America who didn't want to be with us anymore.
Mm.
And at least that's Johnson's take. And, I, I can't argue with it.
It's interesting. I have come across the theory that the received pronunciation, which is almost your kind of BBC
Yeah.
English, was created. What's quite interesting is if you go to parts of the southwest in England,
Mhm.
they still speak with a form of rhoticity, where
Oh,
they pronounce their R's in a similar-ish way to Americans do. And there's
oh,
actually
really?
a really interesting video on YouTube called "The Americans Who Still Speak with Regional British Accents." And I know a gentleman. I played a game on this gentleman I know. He's got a very strong southwestern accent, and I played him this video without him seeing the title. And I said, I want you to
Mhm.
guess where these people were from, and he guessed they were from the southwestern England. Really, they were from New England,
Really?
which was really fascinating. Whereas out beyond the southwestern England, most places drop rhoticity completely.
Oh, sure.
They pronounce their T's not like D's like Americans do, and importantly, they pronounce car rather than car, for
Yeah.
example, which is really fascinating. Also, the national anthem. Talk to our listeners about that. The national anthem was originally a British tune, wasn't it? The
I think it was wasn't it a British drinking
Yeah, yeah.
tune, I believe?
Fascinating, fascinating,
Oh yeah, without question. Absolutely.
fascinating.
Well, and but that's what we do. I think we pick and choose the parts of the history that we want
hmm
that speaks to our narrative, and we discard. And then, back to the topic that we've discussed. The bad news is, and I know it's fashionable to say that history is written by the winners,
hmm
right? But it also does a grave disservice to the losers,
Yeah.
or to those who were not considered the winners. That might be a better way to phrase it, because what it does is it marginalizes or diminishes their experience. So when we say something like, "Oh, come on, slavery was 200 years ago, get over it." Well, they fail to remember that for about 100 years after the Civil War, we did our level best to keep a separate but equal, and that was in name only, society in the South,
Mm,
where the freed slaves and their descendants weren't able to vote except under great personal threat to themselves, where they had to use separate bathrooms, public facilities, separate water fountains. By the way, the bathrooms that they would be asked to use often were broken, um, or 14 or so blocks apart. So you better leave with ample time, or put in public schools that were separate.
hmm
Uh, think about what that does to a person psychologically. And they've done studies of this where African American girls back in the 30s and 40s would instinctively, if they were held up a black doll or a white doll, would pick the white doll. And when they would describe them, oh, the white doll is pretty, the white doll is smart, the white doll is funny, and so forth. And and that's the part of the history that we fail to acknowledge, and that we, by not having these honest, open conversations, what did that do to you? How do you feel about that? And not coming at it from a defensive posture, but but truly trying to understand. I think it's very rich when people that look like me tell African Americans how much better they have it. I might as well tell a woman how much easier childbirth is too, because I don't know anything about that either. I think the conversations need to be had,
Yeah.
and there's that wonderful word compassion, and it comes from a Latin word compati, and it means literally to suffer with another. I don't think we're going to ever really heal the wounds that have been caused and that are continually reopened until we truly sit down and suffer with
Mm,
those descendants of the slaves.
hmm
I really don't.
Absolutely. So it's a topic that we could explore in the future. But for now, I want to ask you one final question in
Sure.
summary. Has the legacy of British America had an overall positive or negative effect on the USA?
You know, that's a great question. And I guess the answer is always, well, it depends.
Mhm.
And it really does depend. As an American, I could certainly say, well, yes, it's had a very positive effect. Look at what we did. We defeated Hitler. We rallied we did this, we did that. But there are an awful lot of folks around the world who would say they think it was a negative effect. I'm not sure that the Vietnamese necessarily think that our involvement in their lives was a positive. Uh, but probably the people in Eastern Europe would say, no, the involvement of the Americans was a positive. Um, so I think that's always the thing in understanding history is understanding the impact of your actions on others. It's that emotional intelligence of self-awareness, you know, and understanding that it may be a positive to you, but was that necessarily a positive to others as well?
Mm-hmm.
I would love to believe, and I think that history probably would support me on this, that it has been more positive than negative.
Okay, brilliant.
However, the negative needs to be addressed as well and accepted and understood.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Mr. Ashcraft, it's been an absolute pleasure to do this interview with you.
And the
Um,
same with you, James.
to our listeners, you should go on to YouTube because William has a YouTube channel where he has provided some educational contents, which I found very insightful and educational. And I'm sure our audience will as well. You can get in touch with myself through Facebook and Instagram under the Association of Former British Colonies, where I try to post educational content and different perspectives that people have about the British Empire. In this episode, we covered the USA. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. Bye for now.